It is a confounding discovery that is rocking the very foundations of what we thought we knew about the origins of civilization.
These are the big questions. I think to answer these, we have to go inside and have a closer look.
There is a question that sits underneath every history book ever written about the first cities on Earth, and for 200 years, almost nobody asked it out loud. Where did the people who invented writing actually come from, and where did they go? We have their words. Tens of thousands of clay tablets survive from Sumer, recording grain shipments, court disputes, hymns to forgotten gods, and the oldest love poem ever set down by human hands. What we do not have, in any museum on Earth, is a single confirmed skeleton we can call Sumerian and test. And when scientists finally found a way around that problem, by reading the DNA of the people living on that same land today, the picture that came back did not look anything like the tidy story generations of students were taught. For most of the 20th century, the origin of the Sumerians was treated as settled business. The standard account held that they simply grew out of the Ubaid farmers, who had worked the marshes of southern Iraq for thousands of years before the first cities appeared. One people, one place, a straight line from Mudbreak village to Ziggurat. It was a clean answer, and clean answers tend to survive not because they are proven, but because nobody bothers to keep testing them. Yet a few stubborn details never fit. Sumerian, the language, has no known relatives, living or dead, anywhere on the planet. It is what linguists call an isolate, a language with no family tree at all. Stranger still, when writing shows up at the city of Uruk around 3200 BC, it does not look like a slow invention still finding its feet. It looks close to fully formed. Scholars had a name for this whole tangle of contradictions, the Sumerian problem. Mostly, they filed it away and moved on, because there was no tool available that could actually test it. That tool eventually arrived, and it came from an unexpected direction. Ancient DNA analysis had already rewritten the story of prehistoric Europe, tracing the movements of Neanderthals, early farmers, and steppe herders through genetic material pulled out of bones tens of thousands of years old. Scientists reasonably assumed the same approach would work in Mesopotamia. It did not, at least not directly, and the reason is almost embarrassingly simple: geography. DNA is a chemically fragile molecule. It survives best in cold, dry, stable conditions, which is exactly what much of northern Europe offers in frozen or peat-preserved graves. Southern Iraq offers the opposite. Blistering heat combined with humidity rising off the marshlands is one of the fastest ways to destroy genetic material, and after a century of excavation, researchers had recovered essentially no usable ancient DNA from the classic Sumerian heartland around Uruk, Ur, and Eridu. The civilization that taught humanity to keep permanent records turned out to be nearly invisible in the one archive science trusts the most, the genome. So researchers did what scientists do when the direct route is blocked: they looked for a workaround. If the bones of the Sumerians themselves were gone, perhaps their genetic signature still lingered in the people who never left that land. The most promising candidates were the Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, a community whose way of life in the wetlands, where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, had changed remarkably little across millennia. They build reed houses using construction methods that resemble depictions on Sumerian art thousands of years old. They still navigate the marshes in similarly shaped boats. If any population alive today carried a strong genetic echo of the ancient population of southern Mesopotamia, the Marsh Arabs seemed like the best possible candidate to test. In 2011, a team led by geneticist Nadia Al-Zahari at the University of Pavia published exactly that test. Her group examined the Y chromosome, which passes almost unchanged from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child, in a sample of 143 Marsh Arab men, alongside a broader comparison group of Iraqis. Site index BASH4-1. The Marsh Arab paternal line turned out to be dominated by haplogroup J1, adding up to roughly 81% of the sample, while other Iraqis showed a far more mixed Y chromosome pool, with only about 31% J1 alongside sizable shares of J2, R1, and other lineages. Site. Within that dominant J1 group, one specific branch, known as J1P58, stood out even further. Site index clash 3 won among marsh Arabs, specifically. This branch reached roughly 74% of the sample, its highest recorded frequency anywhere, while the older, more diffuse form of J1 was concentrated instead in northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey. Et/Sot. For a population this size, that level of concentration in a single paternal lineage is unusual. Most human populations carry a mosaic of different male lineages, the accumulated record of many separate founding fathers over thousands of years. Finding 3 out of every 4 men, tracing back to one relatively narrow branch, suggested that something, at some point, had funneled the marsh Arab paternal gene pool through a very tight bottleneck. The maternal line told an entirely different story. Site Index 2 won across both the marsh Arabs and the wider Iraqi comparison group. The mitochondrial DNA reflected a broad, long-standing Middle Eastern ancestry with only weak outside influence, more so than what showed up on the male side. Et/Site. In plain terms, the women's genetic lineage looked ordinary, deeply rooted, and largely undisturbed. The men's lineage looked like it had been through a squeeze that the women's had not. Researchers attribute this kind of split to something called sex-biased demographic history. In many traditional societies, patterns like patriarchality, where wives moved to join their husband's community, combined with polygyny and unequal rates of male versus female migration, can cause the male lineage to narrow much faster than the female lineage over generations. It does not require some dramatic single event. It can simply be the slow, compounding effect of the same small set of paternal lines reproducing more successfully, generation after generation, inside a relatively closed community. Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, and also where it gets easy to overstate. Geneticists can estimate roughly when a Y chromosome lineage began its expansion by measuring the accumulated mutations along its branches and running the mutation rate backward. A method that produces what is often called a molecular clock. When al-Zahiri's team applied this to the J1P58 lineage, found so heavily among marsh Arabs, the estimated expansion window lined up in the general neighborhood of the era when Sumerian city-states were flourishing in southern Mesopotamia. It is a tempting coincidence. A genetic bottleneck opening up around the same rough period that Uruk, Ur, and Lagash were growing into some of the first true cities on Earth, with concentrated wealth, powerful ruling lineages, and the kind of social stratification that tends to reward a small number of men with disproportionately many descendants. But the researchers themselves were careful, and it matters that we are careful too. Molecular clock estimates built from short tandem repeat mutation rates carry wide margins of error, often spanning thousands of years in either direction. A dating method that says an expansion is centered somewhere in a broad range, covering both the early Bronze Age and periods many centuries later, is not the same as a method that pins an event to a specific century. The honest reading of the al-Zahiri study is not "this proves the marsh Arabs are the genetic descendants of the Sumerians." It is closer to "this is suggestive, worth investigating further, and consistent with a genuine local expansion tied to the region's urban history, without being proof of a direct, unbroken bloodline back to specific, historical Sumerians." The paper's own authors describe the pattern as evidence of genetic stratification associated with the Sumerian era, language that is notably more careful than the version that circulates in popular retellings. There is also a competing, much less dramatic explanation that any honest account has to sit with. Small, geographically isolated communities can lose genetic diversity simply through genetic drift, the random loss of lineages over generations that has nothing to do with any specific ancient population. The marsh Arabs lived in a somewhat enclosed environment for a long time. A near-total dominance of one paternal lineage could reflect centuries of relative isolation acting on whatever lineages happened to be present, rather than a direct signal specifically inherited from Sumerian city builders 4,500 years ago. Distinguishing between these two explanations, a true Bronze Age urban signal versus ordinary demographic drift in an isolated marsh community, is exactly the kind of problem that current data cannot fully settle. Both researchers in the original study and outside geneticists who have discussed the results since have flagged this as a real limitation, not a footnote to be quietly dropped. None of this makes the Marsh Arab data meaningless. It simply means the honest headline is smaller and more interesting than the sensational one. What the study reliably shows is that southern Iraq's marsh population carries an unusually concentrated, locally rooted paternal lineage, one whose deepest genetic diversity is actually centered further north, in the region spanning northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey, with the marsh population representing a later, narrower offshoot. That detail matters more than it first appears. A lineage's oldest, most varied form tends to sit closest to where it originated, because mutations accumulate the longer a population has lived somewhere. If the deepest branching of this lineage sits to the north, then whatever community carried it into the southern marshes did not spring from that land. They arrived there, at some point, from somewhere else. Which brings us to the second major line of research, one that approaches the same question from an entirely different angle, not the Y chromosome of a living community, but actual ancient genomes recovered from northern Mesopotamia, a region cool and dry enough, in patches, to have preserved something the Deep South never could. In 2022, a team led by Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard, working alongside colleagues including David Reich, published the first ancient DNA data recovered from Neolithic populations across northern Mesopotamia, southeastern Turkey, Cyprus, and the northwestern Zagros Mountains. eSite Index CLEC 12 once the genomes showed that these populations and their neighbors were formed through the blending of several older source populations connected to Anatolian, Caucasus, and Levantine hunter-gatherer ancestry, producing a continuum of ancestry that mirrors the actual geography of West Asia. N/Site. In other words, well before Sumerian cities existed, and well before a single symbol had been pressed into wet clay at Uruk, the people living across this broader region were already a genetic mixture, shaped by repeated contact and interbreeding among several distinct ancestral groups spread across the Fertile Crescent. This matters enormously for the old assumption that the Ubaid farmers of southern Iraq represented some kind of pure, isolated local stock from which the Sumerians simply emerged unchanged. Site Index SES 11, 1/4. The Lazaridis team specifically studied early Mesopotamian farmers and their genetic contributions to neighboring populations. Using data spanning Neolithic communities from the Zagros Mountains, Cyprus, Armenia, and Mesopotamia itself, built from roughly 1.2 million genetic markers analyzed through population modeling./site. The resulting picture was not one isolated group sitting quietly on one patch of land for millennia. It was a network of related, but genetically distinct populations already in motion, already mixing, long before urban civilization appeared. A meaningful current in that mixture flowed westward out of the Zagros Mountains, the highland range running along the eastern edge of Mesopotamia in what is now western Iran. By the time the earliest farming villages had matured into fully developed cities, the population living across the plain had already absorbed generations of contact with people from those eastern highlands. There is something almost poetic, though scientists are careful to flag it as speculation, rather than established fact, in how this lines up with Sumerian mythology itself. Sumerian religious texts repeatedly describe the mountains to the east as the origin point of the gods and of civilization's gifts, a recurring motif that scholars spent a century treating as symbolic language rather than literal geography. It would be an overreach to claim the genetics prove those myths were memories of real migration. The honest position is that the genetic data happens to point toward the same general direction those old stories always pointed, and that coincidence is worth noting, even though it cannot be treated as confirmation. Myth is not data. But it is a strange thing when a direction preserved in religious storytelling for 4,000 years turns out to roughly match a direction now independently suggested by population genetics. Follow-up research has reinforced part of this picture further. A more recent study examining ancient Na sampled along the eastern edge of the Zagros region, across roughly 3,000 years, spanning the Bronze Age through the era of the Persian empires, found that the population contributing that eastern genetic influence to Mesopotamia was not the product of a single migration event that happened once and then faded. Instead, the connection between the highland populations and the lowland city-building societies appears to have persisted across an extended stretch of Mesopotamian history through the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Persian periods alike. That is a meaningfully different claim than a wave of migrants arrived once and disappeared into the population. It suggests an ongoing relationship between highlands and lowlands that continued for the length of Mesopotamian civilization, not a one-time event locked into a single ancient chapter. Now turn to modern Iraq as a whole, rather than just the Marsh Arab community, and the genetic picture spreads out considerably. Site index back 4-1 where Marsh Arabs show that heavy concentration of J1 lineages. Broader samples of Iraqis show a much more varied Y chromosome pool, with J1 making up around 31%, J2 around 24%, and various R1 lineages making up roughly 21%, alongside smaller but still notable shares of other haplogroups, .cells/site. This wider spread is exactly what you would expect from 4,000 years of subsequent history. After the political collapse of the Sumerian city-states, the region absorbed wave after wave of new populations and rulers: Akkadians, Amorites, Assyrians, Babylonians, then Persians, the Greek successor states following Alexander's conquests, Arab dynasties, Mongol incursions, and Ottoman administration. Each of these left some genetic trace behind, contributing lineages like J2 and various R1 branches that trace back toward Anatolia and the Iranian plateau. One asymmetry in this later layering deserves particular attention, because it reflects a broader pattern seen across many regions with long histories of conquest and migration. Incoming genetic influence, tracked through Y chromosome data, tends to run noticeably higher than incoming genetic influence, tracked through mitochondrial DNA. This pattern typically indicates that the men involved in conquest, trade networks, and long-distance migration intermarried into existing communities more than entire family units relocated together, meaning the maternal lineage of a region often stays comparatively more stable across centuries of political upheaval, even as the paternal lineage absorbs more outside influence. Applied to Iraq, this would mean that even as empire after empire swept across Mesopotamia, the deeper maternal genetic signal connecting back toward the Neolithic populations of the region remained comparatively more continuous, carried forward generation after generation, even as the paternal lineage picked up more outside contributions along the way. Strip away those later historical layers, at least in a rough analytical sense, and researchers find a shared genetic foundation running underneath both the Marsh Arab population and the broader Iraqi population. A core of long-established Middle Eastern paternal lineages combined with maternal haplogroups that have been present in the region since the Neolithic period. Related communities, such as Assyrians, Iraqi Jews, and Mandeans, groups separated from one another by religion and by language, also show connections to this same underlying regional genetic layer, distinct from the additional lineages introduced by later invasions and migrations. The overall picture that emerges is one of a shared, deep regional foundation, onto which many additional layers were added by the long parade of empires that followed Sumer's political disappearance, rather than one isolated population untouched by everything around it. All of this leads back to a genuinely strange contradiction that both the linguistic and genetic records force us to confront directly. Judged by language, The Sumerians look like one of the most isolated peoples in recorded history, speaking a tongue with no confirmed relatives on Earth, dead or alive. Judged by their genetic ancestry, the opposite is true. The population of ancient Mesopotamia was formed through repeated mixing with neighboring populations, from the Levant, Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Zagros highlands, embedded in a regional network of contact and intermarriage rather than isolated from it. A people can apparently be linguistically unique while being genetically unremarkable, and how thoroughly they mixed with their neighbors. That is not the kind of contradiction our intuitions are built to expect. We tend to assume that a truly original culture must come from some correspondingly unique or isolated population, some group that built everything from scratch in isolation. Sumer appears to break that assumption cleanly in two. Its language came from nowhere researchers have been able to trace. Its ancestry came from practically everywhere around it. It is worth being honest about what remains unresolved, because the responsible version of this story is also the more interesting one. Every conclusion described here rests on proxies, on ancient genomes recovered from northern Mesopotamia rather than the Sumerian heartland itself, and on the DNA of living communities descended, at some uncertain distance, from the populations who actually built Uruk and Ur. Nobody has yet recovered confirmed, well-preserved ancient DNA from a verified Sumerian individual buried in the Sumerian cities themselves. Until that happens, and it may never happen given how thoroughly the hot, humid soil of southern Iraq destroys organic material, this entire picture remains an inference built from descendants and neighbors rather than direct testimony from the Sumerians themselves. The sites most likely to hold the answer sit beneath modern cities, in regions affected by decades of conflict, or behind excavation permits that have been difficult to secure for years. Even a fresh excavation tomorrow would still face the same climate that destroyed the evidence in the first place.